Hello, and welcome back to our series on the Jews in the Golan in antiquity. Today we're going to be dealing with the issue of pottery and daily life in the Golan and what we can learn about that daily life of the Jews who lived there from the pottery remains. So we'll take a look today first a bit in general, why we study pottery, how we can learn about daily life. Following that, we'll focus on a number of studies that we've done over the past years on pottery in the Golan, especially from the Jewish villages, what we can learn about their daily life from those finds. And we'll even take a look at some rabbinic sources and how they can help us understand the daily life in the Golan, and also maybe how the archaeology helps us understand those rabbinic sources. We'll begin a bit with just the issue of rural settlements and what we can learn about daily life. Most people in antiquity lived in the villages. They lived in rural sites. But the truth is, we know very little about their daily life. Historical sources will deal with wars, they'll deal with politics, and many times they'll deal with the cities. But what about the average person who lived in a village? What do we know about them? What do we know about the socioeconomic ties that they had? How independent was the village? There's a lot of information missing, and this is not just in the Golan, but all throughout the Roman Empire from the 1st through 4th centuries. To what extent are the villages dependent on the cities? To what extent are they interconnected with each other? And all this type of information we can really only know from the archaeological finds because historical sources are lacking on this type of information. One of our ways to understand daily life is to looking at pottery. Now, pottery really is one of the most common finds at any archaeological excavation. It's so common, in fact, we discard sometimes 80 to 90% of it, and it has two main functions in archaeology. The first function is for dating. Based upon the type, based upon the material, we can tell chronology, usually within 100 or 150 years, when was a certain cooking pot dated to, a certain storage jar, an oil lamp, and that's one of the ways, besides coins and other finds, we date in archaeological strata. But there's a whole another area of expertise, of research that we can learn from pottery, and that's by human behavior. The idea of learning about pottery from human behavior is something we've only really done since the 1960s, but already there's a large amount of material of 60 years using this type of research, even more. And this was started by Matson, who already in the 1960s says to us that unless ceramic studies lead to a better understanding of the cultural context in which the objects were made and used, they form a sterile record of limited worth. And what he's just talking about is that if we can understand the pottery, not just when it dates to, or even the designs on it, but how was it made? What was the process? And then most important, where was it marketed to? We can learn about socioeconomic connections, religious connections, connections between different regions. And this, in order to do this, we can't just look at the pottery, but we have to use different scientific methods in order to understand the pottery itself. In the area of the land of Israel, we know of today of around 60 sites in which pottery was made, where they were produced, and it's key to know where the pottery was produced in order to understand in the end to where it was marketed to, and we'll talk about that in a few minutes. If you take a look here on the map, you can see the area of the Golan, and there's a disproportionate amount of pottery production sites that have been identified in the Golan, making it a very good area to learn about socioeconomic trade, because once you know where the site is, you can then start to follow where the pottery was marketed to. Now, how do we know if a site produced pottery or not in ancient times? Well, there's two main types of archaeological evidence. First of all, it's almost never from the historical sources. Very rarely does a historical source or rabbinic source mention a site where pottery was produced. It happened once in a while, but overall, they don't really mention them. In archaeological surveys and excavations, we have two types of finds that say, here, pottery was produced in antiquity. The first is wasters. Wasters means pottery that did not come out well, pottery that has some sort of disform, and people didn't sell it. And even today in traditional areas of pottery production, what do you do with pottery that did not come out well? You throw it out right next to the kiln. So our assumption is, our hypothesis is in archaeology, and it's pretty well founded now, and has been tested and proven to be true in most cases, is that if pottery didn't come out well, the potter would just throw it out next to the kiln, and then we come over 2,000 years later, 1,500 years later, and we'll uncover their trash. But their trash lets us know here pottery was produced. The other sign, archaeological evidence of pottery production, is kilns. Is an oven in which pottery was made, And that's also another clear sign of pottery production. In some sites, you only have the wasters. In some sites, you only have the kiln, but you didn't find the wasters. And in some sites, you'll find both of them. Now, once we know where the production site is, we then have to try and characterize the pottery that was made there. And when I say characterize, it's not just looking at the pottery and said, here they made cooking pots, here they made oil lamps, here they made storage jars, but I want to get a chemical fingerprint, and I want to get a microscopic fingerprint of the pottery that was made. Two methods that are commonly used in studies of human behavior with pottery is chemical analysis known as nutrient activation analysis. And what I present to you today was done along with my colleagues at the Archaeology Laboratory at the University of Missouri. And we'll also take a look at petrography, mineralogical analysis, which you do in a microscope, and also what I present today was done at our lab at Haifa University. If we can characterize the chemical properties of the pottery and the mineralogical properties of the pottery at a certain production site, we'll find that they're unique from each site. Now, without going into all of the science behind this, because that would take a few more lectures, and there's also a question of, in a certain sense, how interesting that is for the general public, but the findings from them are interesting. And what we do with these analytical methods is we give the fingerprint, and they're unique to each site. Once we know that they're unique to each site, we can then try and follow the pottery. So I'll characterize the pottery from a certain site. I'll realize what elements are in it, what are the ratios of those elements to each other. I'll realize what are the unique mineralogical attributes from that site. And now I can see, well, do I find similar ones at consumer sites? Do I find similar types of pottery at sites that are further away, that are close by? And that will allow me now to follow the ties. So we just need to understand that part of the background in order to understand the rest of our lecture today. Once I've characterized the pottery, I can now try and follow it. And then I can see, did a Jewish site that made pottery distribute to a pagan site? Did a site in the Golan distribute to a site in the Galilee? And all of this I can know only if I use the analytical studies. It's not enough just to look at the pottery itself. We'll also take a look today at two types of vessels: storage jars, storage vessels, and cooking vessels. Now, why do we study both of them? We study both of them because, first of all, we'll find that many sites either produced or storage vessels or cooking vessels. But we also find is that their marketing mechanisms are different. Why did somebody in antiquity buy a storage jar? In general, someone buys a storage jar not for the jar itself, but for the contents of the jar. There's a phrase in rabbinic literature attributed to Rabbi or to Rabbi Meir in the chapters of the Fathers in Pirkei Avot that says, "Al tistakel bakankan ela b'ma sheyesh bo." When you look at a person, you don't judge them by the outside appearance, but by the content of their character. And the same actually is, why is that taken? They use the storage jar as part of that, as part of that idea. That don't look at the storage jar, but look at its contents. So the storage jar was sold for its contents. A cooking vessel, just like today when you buy a cooking pot or a pan, isn't sold with the meat or the fish inside. It was bought for the vessel itself. So they might have different marketing mechanisms. So we kind of look at both when we deal with pottery studies. Now, all what we described now was the background, and now we'll try and get into the meat of the subject, and we'll take an example from one of the sites we've studied, and that's the site of Majduliyya, a site I've excavated over the past 10 years, and a site also which there's evidence for pottery production. What's also good about this site is that the site is very well defined chronologically. It begins at the end of the Second Temple period in the 1st century BCE, and was abandoned sometime in the late 3rd century CE for reasons to date that we still do not know. But because it's well defined chronologically, it's a good site to study the Roman period Jews of the Golan. If we take a look at this site, we'll notice that at the site we've excavated different areas, and each area tells us something different about the site. So we excavated industrial areas where we uncovered pottery kilns, and we also uncovered olive presses. We excavated their residential areas, and we also excavated a public building, which was the synagogue. The pottery kilns were found in the eastern area of the site, and we've discovered to date 3 pottery kilns. All of the pottery kilns that we found actually all are making cooking pots. Now, how do we analyze the site? Well, we tried and characterize the pottery that was made at the site, and we take a look how much is actually distributed within the site. We then tried and take a look, Well, did the pottery made at the site get to sites that were close by, within 1 to 3 kilometers from the site? We also took a look, did pottery made at the site make its way to the large urban center? Now, of course, we didn't only study pottery, we studied bones, we studied metal objects, but today we'll present the pottery. So here we're looking again at the kilns of Majduliyya that were found in Area C and going right up next to the area of the synagogue in Area A. Here you're taking a look where the east is on the top of the orthophoto that you see before you. And what's interesting is that 2 of the kilns are somewhat far away from the synagogue, but 1 kiln is actually directly next to the area of the synagogue. This brings us to an interesting rabbinic source, which says that kilns must be situated at a distance at least of 50 cubits from the city or from the village. 50 cubits will come out to about 25 meters. And the kilns at Majduliyya, the 2 kilns on the left, well, they are close to that distance, but the one near the synagogue is right close next to it. And it's much, much closer than the 25 meters. And it raises an interesting question. Now, Majduliyya is a Jewish site. It could be they didn't heed to this rabbinic halakha that was done for how far you should keep a kiln away. And it could be also the reason we have this rabbinic law is because some people didn't listen to it. Now, why does anyone care about the distance of a kiln from the site? Well, it seems to be that if a kiln is close to the site, it actually has a lot of smoke. It's an industry that has some sort of pollution, and therefore rabbinic law said keep it away from the main area. And by the way, this is only in rabbinic sources. Julian of Ashkelon, which is a treatise of creeds from the Byzantine period, which is a Christian source, also mentions keeping away the kilns from residential areas and areas people lived in at a site. What do we know about the kilns from Majduliyya? They're all a type of an updraft kiln, meaning they have a central pillar. They have a floor upon which the pottery was placed after it was dried. And the bottom of it, which is kind of what you see now in the pictures, is the bottom of the kiln. That's where you would actually have the firing area. And then the kiln is closed over using these different types of organic material, ceramic material. The pottery is fired. And once it's ready, the top is broken off and the pottery is taken out. Whatever didn't come out good was thrown out next to the site. Well, we did different analyses of the pottery. And one of the first things we wanted to know, where did they get the raw material to make the site? The potters at Majduliyya, of which 3 kilns were found, and there were probably more, did they go far away? Why did they even make pottery at the site? Did they have to import raw material? Where did they get the clay to make the site? And here you're looking at analysis, a microscopic analysis of the pottery, where you just saw off a bit of the pottery, you make it very, very, very thin to what's called 30 microns, about 0.003 millimeters, and then you look under a polarizing microscope and identify the different type of minerals and clays that were used. And the clay that you see here is a basaltic type clay, meaning they used a local clay that was probably found in the area of the site. Now, if we look at the geology of Majduliyya, we see different types of basalt. What's one basalt known as covering basalt and one basalt known as dalaweh basalt. The covering basalt has a very, very thick soil and clay material, and the dalaweh basalt is a very, very rocky type of basalt. Interesting, Majduliyya is located on the meeting point of these 2 types of basalt. And our question was, can we identify exactly where they took the clay from to make the pots? And this would tell us something about the socioeconomic daily life of the village. Well, one of the tests we did is a granulometric test, where what you do is you take different soil samples and you actually describe them by size. This we did at a laboratory by Kinneret Academic College, the Samach laboratory, and here it's split it into different size of grains. Clay, which is large particles, silt, which is slightly smaller, and clay, which is very, very small particles, silt, which is intermediate particle size, and sand, which is very, very large. And we took soil samples from around the site to see does anything match what we saw in the microscopic sample of the particle sizes. And we actually found 2 of the samples had a very, very high clay content, which matches what you would want to have for making pottery, especially for cooking pots. Well, we then saw that those samples were taken from an area a bit north of the site where you find the covering basalt. and it's only 140 meters from the site, meaning that the clay they took seemed to have come exactly close to the site, which could be one of the reasons why they made pottery here. And it could be that the same family that's making the pottery is also the same family that's taking out the clay. We actually tried to reconstruct cooking pots from this type of clay. This is a study that we have not yet finished, but here you can see some of the cooking pots that were made by Cohen. She was a potter from Nov, a village nearby, and she actually took some of the soil samples and tried making them today. And I currently have a student working on a similar project where we're trying to use the same clay and seeing, can we reconstruct the pots that were made? So if we actually know where pottery was made at the site of Majduliyya, for example, we now want to look at it in the larger context. One of the interesting aspects is that there are other sites making pottery as well at the same time as Majduliyya. So it's not the only site in the Golan that's making the pottery, but even more than that, there's other sites that are making the exact same type of cooking pots. And these sites are all very close by to Majduliyya, and at least 3 of them, of the 4 sites, are all in the Jewish area. And you can see there on the map of Jornia, Tzalabeh, and Fahura, which is right near the site of Katzrin. And that's also something interesting. Why did you have 4 different sites making the same type of cooking pots at the same time? One thing we looked at was the chemical analysis, the chemical fingerprint of these sites. Because if they're all making pottery at the same time, one of the things you might think is they're all using the same clay source to make their pottery, which should also tell you about some sort of socioeconomic connections between these sites. But when we look at the chemical fingerprint, we find something interesting. And now I have to bring you further into the field of analytical archaeology. And here we're going to try to do something in Beit Avichai, which is not usually done, which is try and bring some sort of the analyses, which are usually stay in the field of academia, to the larger public who should be interested in what we found. If you take a look at this plot here, it's a plot called a discriminant analysis plot. That's a statistical method where you take a look at a number of variables at the same time. I won't go into much further than that. But what I want you to do is look at how the plot works. If you can see, you'll see different symbols with different colors. Each symbol represents a single piece of pottery from a different pot. If the symbols cluster together, it means their chemical composition is similar. If the symbols are far from each other, it means that they're different. And what does that mean for us? Symbols that cluster together show that they're from a similar production site. And if they're further apart from each other, then there's no connection between that production site and the other symbols. So each symbol here is from a different site. And now we want to look at where are they clustering. Each symbol here is actually from a different production site. Now, if they were taking clay from the same source, they should have overlap. But if each there's taking clay from a different source, then they should be distinct, which is what you see over here. Each production site clusters amongst itself. What do we learn from that? That although they're all taking actually basaltic soil and basaltic clays for the production site, each one is using a different source. And without going into much further, we know that each source seems to be close to that production site itself. So that means each production site is kind of independent. And while they're all making the same type of form on the outside, it looks like the same pot, they're all using a clay that's near to each site by itself, probably only a couple hundred meters from the site. At Majduliyya, it seems to be very close, maybe only 150 meters away from where the kiln was. Now, once we've been able to distinguish Majduliyya as a unique production site, meaning I can identify the pottery that was made there, I can now try and look at where did that pottery get to. Did it get to the cities? Did it get to other sites nearby? And so we're going to take a bit look of what we can learn about daily life from the pottery that we found. Where was it made? Where was it marketed to? Now, in a second, we'll take a look what the archaeological evidence will tell us about cooking pots and how they show us connections between sites. But I want to, for a minute, talk about rabbinic sources. Rabbinic sources are unique in that they're one of the only literary evidences in all of the Roman Empire for daily life and even especially for pottery production and distribution. There's very little, let's say, Roman literary sources that deal with that subject, mainly because it's really not interesting as wars or politics. But if we want to learn about daily life, rabbinic sources will allow us to learn about it. Now, why is it also unique? because not only do we have rabbinic sources that deal with the area of northern Israel, they also deal with archaeological evidence for which we can relate back to the literary sources, and that makes it a very rare region for the study of daily life. When we look at rabbinic sources, they explicitly talk about the marketing of pottery and of the marketing of cookingware. And here I brought some of the sources. The kadar is used in rabbinic sources as talking about a person who maybe made the pottery, but definitely it's the person who's marketing the kderot, the cooking pots. And what we see is when that person is marketing the cooking pots, he takes them on his shoulders and will go from the production site and will go from village to village, calling out, saying the pots are here, and will be selling them. Because we actually have a debate in archaeology, how was the pottery marketed? Do people go to the potter? Did the potter go to the people? Did they go to a central area? And at least from rabbinic sources, it seems that the potter may have left the area of production and went and traveled, bringing the wares outside. Well, now we're going to look at the pottery from Majduliyya and see, did any of that pottery make its way to neighboring villages? And here I want to look at two sites. One is the village of Iwanish, which is a Jewish village very, very close to the city of Hippos. And the other site will be the city of Hippos Susita, which is the large city in the area of the southern Golan. So we'll take a look at how does Majduliyya match to these two sites. In other words, did the pottery from Majduliyya make its way to the village of Iwanish, and did it make its way to the large city? A priori, you would think, of course it did. Why wouldn't there be a connection between the Jewish village and another Jewish village of Iwanish? Furthermore, if Hippos is the only large city in the central and southern Golan, it would probably be a marketing center. And if there were 3 kilns all making cookingware at Majduliyya, all, by the way, seem to be dated to the 3rd century, I would expect some of those wares to make its way to the large city of Hippos. So we tested this, and we tested this using chemical analysis, meaning we already defined the chemical fingerprint of the pottery from Majduliyya, and then we took the same types of pottery, the same types of cooking pots from Iwanish, the same types of cooking pot from Hippos, and we used chemical testing on them. When we did that chemical testing, then we're seeing what's the chemical fingerprint. If it matches Majduliyya, it means that pottery came from Majduliyya. But if it does not match Majduliyya, it means it came from somewhere else. Now, all of you here are already experts in looking at these plots. Here you see a plot comparing 2 elements which show the chemical fingerprint of the pottery, hafnium and chromium. And I'll state again that the colors are showing you the different sites, and how they cluster together shows what is chemically similar and what is chemically distinct. And here you can see something very interesting, that the pottery from Majduliyya is distinct from all the other pottery tested. For the pottery from Hippos, which appears as blue circles, and the pottery from Iwanish, which appears as green triangles. What did we learn from that? We learned from that the pottery found at Iwanish and Hippos did not come from Majduliyya. There is no analytical evidence that any of the pottery made from Majduliyya made its way to the main city or made its way to Iwanish. This actually is somewhat surprising because you would expect at least to find, if not most of it, that some of it came from that site. But furthermore, we see something interesting. Iwanish is a Jewish village, and the pottery from there is the same chemical composition from the mainly non-Jewish site of Hippos Susita. Now that's important because you might say, why does the Majduliyya match the pottery from, why does the pottery from Majduliyya not make its way to the city of Hippos? Maybe there's a religious aspect there of kind of the people of Majduliyya not wanting to market in the main pagan site. But we don't see that's the answer here, because Iwanish and Hippos are taking their pottery from the same site. But also take a look down at the lower part of the plot. At the lower part of the plot, you see pottery, both from Iwanish and Hippos, that, based upon other studies we know, is actually not even from the Golan. It was imported from the Galilee. Now, these are pottery of the same forms, meaning the cooking pot on the outside looks the same as those from the Golan, but they come from the pottery production site of Kfar Chananya, a pottery production site that has been well studied for nearly 40 years now by Professor David Adan Bayowitz from Bar Ilan University. And we know that that pottery is well distributed throughout the Galilee, the Golan, and even in northern Jordan and in eastern Syria. So we know that that's a very, very important production site. and some of it is actually found at Iwanish and Hippos, although it's much, much further away than Majduliyya. This will lead us then to ongoing research, because when we look at Majduliyya, okay, we know that pottery was produced there. Right now, we still have to see that any of that pottery comes to the villages nearby, and that's something that we don't have a final answer to yet. But when we look at the villages and the urban center further away, and it's really not that far away, it's only about 15 kilometers away, we see that none of that pottery makes its way to there. So we'll now have to see if it's not at Hippos and it's not at Iwanish, then what happened to the pottery from Majduliyya? Where was it marketed to? Where did it go to? Because the distribution of pottery is showing us socioeconomic connections between people. Now, if we took a look at the cooking pots, let's now take a look at another element of pottery finds, and that comes from the public architecture, and that's going to be from the synagogue. The synagogue is made from beautiful basalt stones, as we learned about in our previous lecture. But one of the other things we find in the synagogue is roof tiles. Now, roof tiles are important. They're important because in the villages, the only building in the Jewish village that has roof tiles, or we'll say pretty much the only building, is the synagogue. In this way, villages are different from urban centers where there are multiple buildings with roof tiles. But the village synagogue is unique. It's the only highly decorated building. It's the only building that will have usually capitals and large columns. It's the only building that might be over 10 meters high. And it's also the only building to use ceramic roof tiles. Now, if it's the only building using it, the question then will be, where did they get those roof tiles from? And you would actually think if they aren't making roof tiles all the time, those roof tiles must have come from the village. Must have come from the urban center, because villages aren't making roof tiles all the time. So here are examples of roof tiles from Majduliyya. And like we said, they're rare at rural sites. And now we want to know, well, where were they produced, right? Were they made at the kiln? Were they made at another nearby rural site? Or were they made at the urban center of Hippos? If I can know where they're made, once again, I learn about socioeconomic connections. I learn about connections between different sites. I learn about daily life of the people. So we use different analytical methods here too in order to learn about the roof tiles. So what can we learn at Majduliyya from the roof tiles? Where were they made? Well, first we look at the site itself. There were 3 kilns found at the site. Maybe at one time they also make the roof tiles to be used in the synagogue. But even when we look microscopically, and even for those people out there who are not experts on microscopic archaeology, take a look at the 2 thin sections from the pottery. And you yourselves can tell, well, you may not know what it says, you can tell they're not similar to each other. You can see there a cooking pot from Majduliyya, which is the reddish clay material, which is made from clays local to the site. And you can see the roof tiles were made from a calcareous clay, a clay with a very high calcium carbonate content, which is not available near the site. Let's say the closest area is about 3 kilometers away, meaning that we have no reason to think that the roof tiles were actually made at the site. We don't know of any pottery made at the site that has clays that were found in the roof tiles. So the roof tiles seem to have not been made at the site, even though there are kilns local to the site. Well, where else could they have been made? So now we're going to compare, if they weren't made at the site, we'll compare the Majduliyya roof tiles to 2 other sites, to the site of Deir Aziz and to the site of Hippos Susita, again, to the main urban center. Why do we compare it to the site of Deir Aziz? Deir Aziz is a Jewish site which existed at the same time as Majduliyya. It's only a couple of kilometers away, but also we know that pottery was produced at that site, including we have evidence actually for the production of roof tiles at that site. It's one of the only sites we know in the country in the Roman period where roof tiles were being produced. We don't know how important that production was to other sites. Maybe it was only used at Deir Aziz, or maybe it was used at other sites. So we compare the roof tiles from Majduliyya to that site. What you can see here is an example of a microscopic analysis from the production site of Deir Aziz, both of the storage jars and roof tiles that were made at that site. And as you can see, they're microscopically the same. In other words, they're using the same type of calcareous material, that means a high carbonate content, to make roof tiles at Deir Aziz. Our question now will be, was Majduliyya roof tiles also made at that site. We'll also compare the Majduliyya roof tiles to the site of Hippos Susita. This is a very good comparison because unlike the rural areas, at Hippos Susita, there's roof tiles used in multiple buildings. And it's likely roof tiles are being made somewhere for that site all of the time throughout the Roman period because there's reconstruction, there's new construction going on, and many of the buildings use roof tiles. Here, for example, you see a reconstruction provided to us by Dr. Michael Eisenberg of the Basilica of Susita, a very large and important building that stood out, that also had a large amount of roof tiles that were found from its collapse in the year 363 CE. So now we can take a look at how these roof tiles look from each other, looked in comparison to each other. But we want to look as the analytical study. Did they use the same clays or not? Were they made at the same production site or not? So once again, we'll use a plot here. Here we're using a statistical analysis known as principal component analysis. And once again, for our listeners and those watching us here, what's important is to look at what clusters together. Again, each color is a different site, each color and shape, and what clusters together means that they're similar in their chemical composition. And here you can see there's really three groups. There's a group from Deir Aziz, a group from Hippos in the middle, and a group from Majduliyya. What does that mean? All of the roof tiles from these sites have distinct compositions. And for us, archaeologically and historically, it means that there's no socioeconomic connection as far as the roof tiles. The roof tiles produced at Deir Aziz did not make their way to Majduliyya and Hippos. The roof tiles used at Majduliyya did not come from the same place as the roof tiles from Hippos. Each one is getting the roof tiles from a different place. All of this is showing actually a lack of socioeconomic connections that were used in the production and distribution of roof tiles from these sites. By the way, the same thing that we saw from the chemical analysis, we also see in the microscopic analysis. Here you're looking at a thin section of a Majduliyya roof tile from a Hippos roof tile. While they're both made from material of high carbonate content, and they're actually both made from Golan available clays, they were taken from different spots. This is important because in any scientific study, you actually want to use two different methods. And if they both show the same result, then you think that result is correct. So what do we see from this? A lack of connection as far as the roof tiles go. And it's just very similar to, as we saw, a lack of connection, at least between Majduliyya and other sites, as far as the cooking pots showed us. Well, we learned something about the cooking pots. We learned something about the roof tiles. What else can we learn from the pottery of the Golan about daily life? An interesting study we did a few years ago, me and my colleague Michael Eisenberg, focused on cooking pots from Hippos. We know now that they're not made from Majduliyya, but we took a look at the pottery from Hippos and we wanted to see where was it made and were there any changes over time. And in this case, we won't go to so much as into the analytical part. We'll just show you the results. But the results here are based upon analytical studies. And we saw the following results. So once again, what are we looking at here? We took cooking pots from Hippos Susita from the Roman period, and we took cooking pots from the early Roman period, meaning from the 1st, 2nd centuries CE, and we also took cooking pots from the mid-2nd to the early 4th century CE, and we said, where are these cooking pots made? And we can know where they're made based upon their chemical and microscopic fingerprint. And we found something that was actually very surprising to us. In the early Roman period, what we found is that most of the cooking pots were not made in the Golan. Most of the cooking pots came from that production site at Kfar Hanania. Kfar Hanania, if I didn't mention before, is a site near Carmiel today. And we saw that in the middle and late Roman period, there's a switch. And most of the cooking pots are actually made locally. We know that they were not made at Majduliyya, but they seem to have been made from a site that right now we don't know where that site is. So here we see some interesting things. We see that by looking at the pottery, we can see that in the 1st century, for example, there seems to be a Galilean Golan connection at the urban site of Hippos. So much so that while there is Golan-made cooking pots, the people of Hippos preferred cooking pots from further away, from Kfar Hanania. But we see that in the middle and late Roman period, although Kfar Hanania is still producing cooking ware, they prefer locally made pots. We don't understand why that is, but we can see that a change is made. And this change, of course, reflects socioeconomic connections. At this point, it's between different regions, between the Galilee and the Golan. We should also note that Kfar Hananya is a Jewish site producing pottery, and Hippos is a predominantly non-Jewish site, meaning that that connection shows a non-Jewish Jewish connection in the early Roman period, but less so, at least between the Galilee and the Golan, in the middle and late Roman period. These results were obtained mainly based upon microscopic analysis, which you can see below. Now, why would they want cooking pots from Kfar Hananya? And why so many? Well, at least we know in the early Roman period, where pottery is being produced, we have rabbinical sources. Actually, this rabbinical source that is from the 2nd century likely, and rabbinical source here talks about the pottery from Kfar Hananya. In fact, there are only 2 sources in all rabbinic literature that explicitly discuss places that where pottery was made. One is the site of Kfar Hananya, and one is the site of Shichin. Both of these sites have undergone archaeological excavations, and they've been identified. What's interesting is that, why does rabbinic sources mention them? Rabbinic sources don't care about where pottery was made. They come to teach us something else. In this case, they're coming to talk to us about the laws of Shabbat. On Shabbat, according to rabbinic law, if there's a fire in your village, you can't put out the fire. I mean, if you're in danger, you could. But if all is in danger is your property, you have to let the fire burn through. But one of the ways to deal with this is that rabbinic sources ask, if I take pottery and I fill it with water and I line it up, is that a way that I can stop the fire? In other words, kind of a trick saying I won't really put it out, but I can stop the fire from being spread. And the rabbinic sources deal with this idea and they say, well, if the pottery is not well made and the fire will cause the pottery to crack and the water to go out and put out the fire, you can't use it. But if the pottery is well made, then you can kind of make you can make a sort of mechitza, you can make a sort of barrier between the pottery, using the pottery, between the fire and what's being burned, and then that's okay. And then they say, what pottery can you use? What pottery doesn't break? And it says you can use pottery from Kfar Hananya and Shichin, ki en darkan lehishtaber. They do not break. But this tells us something else. The pottery from Kfar Hananya and Shichin was considered to be of a higher quality. A higher quality than what? Well, now we know a higher quality than the same forms made in the Golan. The truth is, when I look at pottery made at Majduliyya, although it's using the same form as that in Kfar Hananya, it's kind of soft. It's actually not as high a quality, and the Kfar Hananya pottery is actually of a higher quality. It has a more of a metallic sound. It will break. It will be harder to break. It probably had better thermal properties when being cooked. So that might be why the people in Susita, if they could, they preferred the pottery from Kfar Hananya. Something very interesting is that happen everywhere? The truth is, it does not happen everywhere. When I look at a site like Gamla, which is a Jewish site in the early Roman period, and at least closer has the crow flies to Kfar Hananya, pottery that was checked and analyzed at Gamla showed something different in comparison to Susita from that time. And now I'm talking about from the 1st century. And what was found? At Gamla was found that most of the cooking ware was actually made locally. Some came from Kfar Hananya, some were around between 10, let's say, to 15%. But at Hippos Susita, we saw that over 90% was made at Kfar Hananya. This is in the early Roman period. So this now will raise more questions than we have answers. Once again, what do we see? We see, based upon analytical studies, that in the 1st century, at the non-Jewish site of Hippos, most of their cooking ware comes from the Jewish Galilean site of Kfar Hananya. But at that same time, at the Jewish site of Gamla, most of their pottery is being made locally. So we have questions here. Well, if Gamla is closer, why are they not using the pottery from Kfar Hananya if it's of a higher quality? Furthermore, we can see here that the non-Jewish site has no problem using the Jewish potters from using the pottery made from the Jewish potters at Kfar Hananya. And if the rabbinic sources are indication of marketing mechanisms, it could be they actually made their way physically to Hippos. But if Hippos is further away, then why does that pottery also not make its way to Gamla? These are things we don't really have answers for yet. I can theorize is that Hippos is a much more important site than Gamla in the early Roman period. And it could be that they made their way, even let's say on boats, from Tiberias with their wares to one of the ports by Hippos, and then brought their potteries to the main market there. But to get to Gamla may have been a much harder trek, so they preferred not to do that, the potters from Kfar Hananya, but they focused mainly on getting their wares to the city of hippos. Until now, we've discussed a lot about the cooking ware. We won't discuss now about the storage jars, but I do want to mention one aspect of that. Cooking ware, right, we said in the beginning, represents the production and distribution of cooking ware, which is bought for the pot itself. Storage jars represent contents. That means someone bought it for the content in the jar. And we do know, by the way, that storage jars from the Galilee, made in the Galilee, are actually present at sites in the Golan. That means that people in the Golan, they didn't want the jars. They wanted either wine or olive oil made from the Galilee. However, this gets to an interesting question dealing with daily life. In the Golan, especially in the central Golan, there's a very, very large number of olive presses that were found. At the site of Majduliyya, we know of at least 4 olive presses that were found at the site. We don't know if all were used simultaneously, but 4 is actually a pretty large number. And our question is then, who are they making the olive oil for? Is it just for the site? Well, Majduliyya is not the only site to have a large number of olive presses at Jewish sites. And this seems to have been an important industry. So we know that Jews are making pottery. We know Jews are also making olive oil. By the way, non-Jews are making it as well, but there seems to be a disproportionate amount at the Jewish sites. The question is, well, the pottery from Majduliyya that was made there does not seem to have actually a very large distribution, if at all. It seems to have been used very locally. What about the olive presses? Did the oil there make its way to anywhere else? The truth is, the only way of knowing that is to follow the storage jars. While we have not completed this study yet, we do know something about the Golan storage jars, and that is none of them are really found in any significant proportion at sites in the Galilee. And so that leaves the question, the olive oil made in the Golan, where did it make its way to? Was it just within the Golan? It seems to me that there's too many olive presses to think it just stayed in the Golan. It's possible that it made its way to the east, to the area of the Choran, but this is an analysis that has not yet been done. One of the reasons we think that might be the case is because there are almost no olive presses found in the area to the east of the Golan, but this is one of those areas that will have to wait for further research. If we summarize the evidence we saw today, we saw that at this production site of Majduliyya, which represents what goes on at other production sites, the pottery did not get very far. Not only did it not make its way to the Galilee, it didn't even make its way to the large urban center of Hippos. This tells us something about the local economy that seems to be, at least some of the Jewish sites, to be very limited and probably very self-sufficient. If we take a look at a larger scale, we see very little evidence for any Golan-made pottery in the Galilee, showing that the Golan itself is a periphery area, showing that while we'll import Galilean pottery, it's not exporting to that region. And this tells us something that while there are socioeconomic ties, the Golan seems to have been a periphery area, and it seems not to have been making wares that were needed or used in the Galilee. I hope today we're able to take something that's very common in archaeological finds and sort of the analytical analyses that in many cases stay within the academic community, and hope that we're able to bring it to a larger evidence to learn about something that the only way we can learn about it is from archaeological research, and that is the daily life of Jews in antiquity in the Golan. Thank you very much.